Hi guys, today's video we're going to talk about embellishments or short rudiments that go onto a single sort of downbeat. They're very compact, they're usually made of grace notes or something similar, and there's a whole bunch of them. So the one that I think most people are familiar with in this general category is the flam. So if we have one downbeat here, we can embellish that with a single grace note in front of it. Very close, that's just a normal flam, and of course that's the type of thing we're talking about. There's notation over here, and you can follow along. We'll start with the longest one I have on here is the 4-stroke Ruff. Now you can go longer than this, but we're just going to start here for the sake of we had to pick something, right? The 4-stroke Ruff is 3 grace notes onto a downbeat. In the American and British paradigm, it's sort of single stroked, so you get 3 grace notes in single strokes plus a single stroke for the downbeat. On the PAS rudiment sheet, this is sort of synonymous with the single stroke 4, but it's not written this way. It's the same idea though. In a lot of other places, you could play this with other stickings, but this is like the standard American one. And so, of course, that 4th hit is where the beat actually is. The other 3 are ahead of the beat. Now, if we go shorter, we can have the 3-stroke Ruff, which is the same idea. And I know that the Ruffs are confusing, but the 3-stroke Ruff, when we specify the number 3, we're typically talking about single strokes. So that's going to be similar, just shorter. It's very close to the downbeat, but it is in single strokes. The 3-stroke Ruff is also called a tap Ruff or a single stroke 3. Same thing. This is typically used in keyboards or timpani or maybe on floor toms, places where there's not as much bounce. It's the same idea as the next couple rudiments, but in single strokes. Now if we take that idea and we play it with a double stroke, 2 grace notes, but now it's a double and a single, that's called a drag. So a drag is typically played pretty wide open, and a drag is generally what you want in rudimental music or playing the drum set, but not always. A drag is proportional to the speed you're playing. So if you're playing really slow, the drag would be even more wide open like that, right? If you're playing really fast, it's going to get faster with the speed of the notes. So that is different than the next rudiment, which is a Ruff. Now a lot of people think drags and Ruffs are the same thing. I have a whole video on that topic if you want to go check that out on my channel, wherever that is. But they're not exactly the same because a Ruff is a closed rudiment, which means it's always essentially as fast as you can do it. And so if I play really slowly, or if I play really fast, the Ruff doesn't change. So in that regard, it's more like a flam than a drag. The grace notes are always just smushed right up to the primary note. There are still 2 of them. It's still typically played as a double stroke. It's just much, much faster. Now, if we sort of go to the next step here, this one doesn't fit into the nice progression, but it's a flagada, which is a flam onto a drag onto the downbeat. Now it's different than the 4-stroke Ruff, even though it's the same number of grace notes, in that the flam is sort of close together, and then the double stroke is farther apart. So it is not the same. Here's a 4-stroke Ruff. Here's a flagada. Right, you can hear that the flagada is uneven, and it says its name. Flagada, flagada. Right, this is a French thing. You won't see this in American playing, or really a lot of places in the world, but it does exist, and it's kind of a cool thing. It's like the drag or the Ruff, but also like the flam, and it's in this category, so I just kind of stuck it in here. Okay, so we can go closer and have less notes, and the next thing on the list is the charge stroke. So this is just 1 grace note now, but it's not quite a flam. Some people call it the open flam, but it's 2 distinct hits. Right, and you're just going to do 2 different motions, charge stroke. It's mostly a European thing, although there have been some American books and solos and stuff that require an open flam, and that's basically the same thing. So then we can go to the normal flam, which we talked about earlier, where the notes are almost exactly the same, but not quite, and you only differentiate that by the height of the stick. You play at the same time so that they're very similar, but not quite. And I think most people do know what a flam is already. And we can keep going though. We can play both hands at exactly the same time. So now this is really just 1 note with 2 hands. You shouldn't hear 2 sounds at all if you do it right. It does bring out a different overtone from the drum. It's a different timbre of the instrument, but it's not really louder, and it isn't a flam. Like, it doesn't sound that much different. but it does have like a slightly different tone to it. So this is more used on drum set, timpani, keyboards, stuff like that, but you can play it on the snare drum, and it is sometimes indicated on the snare drum. A lot of the time, the notation will just say both or B under the note instead of R or L, and that's the only way you know this is supposed to happen, but it does happen. Okay, so now we can get to what's really probably weird for some people, which is having grace notes after the primary note. This doesn't happen a whole lot. The most American one of these that everyone's potentially has heard of before, if you watch my channel, I talk about it occasionally, is the Malf, which is just the word flam backwards, and that's what it is a flam backwards. So instead of playing the grace note in the front, we're going to take that same grace note and we're going to put it afterward. It's a little lesser in volume, and it's very close, but it's now on the other side of the beat. The first note is where the downbeat of the the music is, and then it's like an echo. Okay, so this is also a rudiment in Sweden called the trafe or the Nedslag, which is a different way of saying the same thing in the first version of it. It's usually got like a plus on top of the note head, but it's the same thing. It's a downbeat and then an echo of that downbeat. But in Sweden, they can do 2 grace notes after it, and it's still called a Nedslag. And I don't know why there's not really a differentiation, or how you would even know if you're looking at music if you weren't raised in Sweden maybe. But it does exist, and it is just, of course, then like a backwards drag, where it's pretty close to the note, but it's definitely 2 distinct strokes played as a double after the downbeat. So the first note is where the pulse of the music is. This is a really weird concept as an American player, but it does exist. It's a thing. Now, we can sort of combine that a little bit with the flam, and we get the idea of the cheese, where you're going to have a grace note in front, because part of a cheese is a flam, and then you're going to have a note that comes after the downbeat, because of course a cheese is a flam onto a double stroke. So now normally cheeses keep going into other things, but how much of that pattern is actually the cheese, I guess, is up for debate. But the essential feature of any rudiment that includes a cheesed variation is that there is a flam that also lands on a double stroke, and whatever else happens, happens. So the cheese is interesting here because the flam, of course, comes before the downbeat, but the second note of the double stroke comes after the downbeat. So you get a note on both sides of where the official pulse of the music really is. It's the middle of those 3 notes, which is pretty strange if you think about it. If you're into rudimental playing in the modern era, this is a normal thing to see, but it is kind of a strange concept that you're burying the pulse between 2 notes that are very close, but they're not on the pulse. There are other things you can do with this. Like I said, you could go farther forward ahead of the note and play a 5-stroke roll or a 7-stroke roll or whatever leading into the downbeat, and you could write it with grace notes as some type of a ruff, and that exists as long as you want to make it. You can also go after this with buzzes. So we talked about only distinct strokes here today, but you could do like crushed ruffs or fuzzes, which is like a cheese that has a buzz on it, or you could do other things of that nature. You could do ruffs with a buzz instead of a distinct double, and they're in the same vein as the things we talked about. They just have that buzzier tone. So if we recap what we're talking about here today, we have the 4-stroke ruff, the 3-stroke ruff, the drag, the ruff, the flagada, the charge stroke, the flam, the double stop, the Malf, the 3-note Nedslag, and then the cheese, which is sort of all over the place. Right? All of those essentially only embellish 1 downbeat. There's not a whole extended sequence of things for the rudiment, and they really don't take up any extra time per se. You could put essentially anything you wanted in front of it and anything you wanted behind it, and these aren't going to take up more space than the 1 primary note already would. That's what sort of lumps these together conceptually as the same thing. As weird as that is, it's kind of true. So if you have questions about this, let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.